Okay, this is part 3 of the lecture on this chapter 14 on gender and sexuality. We were talking about feminism. I just got into the topic and I was referring to the first paragraph. And read with me. While some may attribute domestic abuse to bad or evil individuals who cannot be controlled, it's clear that it goes far beyond that, since the relatively small number of pathological abusers is not sufficient to account for the many cases of domestic abuse. So the point being there is that you can't blame domestic abuse on certain bad men, for example, because these people are ostensibly good fathers, hard workers, taxpayers, etc., in all other ways, with the one exception being domestic abuse. So what we need to do is look more at the system that produces such individuals. And that's precisely the point of feminism. And of course that system is patriarchy. And I mentioned that in the third paragraph. In other words, it's the system itself that's the problem, a system that's largely invisible because it's taken for granted and rarely critiqued. Patriarchy is to the cultural air we breathe as much as water is to fish. It has become such a natural part of our existence that we no longer actively see it. And then I mentioned there is only one movement that actually challenges patriarchy, and the one that does it most succinctly and most directly is radical liberal feminism, because radical feminism goes farther than other types of feminism by actually critiquing the system itself. In the next couple of paragraphs, I review the history of feminism. The first wave involved the suffragists. You see that word there. These are women who fought for the right to vote, which was finally passed in 1920. They endured all kinds of tortures and hells to get that done, believe it or not. And then we had the second wave of feminism, which occurred in the 1970s or so. And here the focus was on social equality with males in the home and in the workplace, and also an end to sexual objectification. So that's what was important for the second wave. This is also referred to as liberal feminism. Liberal feminism as contrasted with radical feminism. That's sort of associated with the third wave. And as you can see in that last paragraph there in section 4, the third wave, their emphasis is on total self-determination and the freedom to pursue any and all lifestyles of one's choosing. So what the third wavers want to see is total autonomy for women to choose their own destiny, their own lifestyle, whatever it may be. And radical feminism is actually associated with that, because radical feminism, as I said, attacks patriarchy, the very system that has caused the problems to begin with. Okay, chapter 11, section 5 is on human sexuality. Let's see, the third paragraph addresses sexual guilt. Now, I'm not going to get into this because basically it is a very good review of a topic we have already taken up in our discussion of Becker, but I would highly, highly advise that you block out that entire paragraph on sexual guilt. It's a nice review of the notion of sexual guilt, that I said, as we covered in Becker. And then under specific sexual practices, first, heterosexuality. First sentence, heterosexual practices, unsurprisingly, can be located on a continuum ranging from the highly restrictive to the highly permissive. And you can see that I do actually give you a few examples of cultures that are highly restrictive, and some cultures that are very, very permissive. And towards the end of that discussion, I do note that American culture would fall somewhere in between these two extremes, neither highly restrictive nor highly permissible. Section 6 is on other sexual practices. There's an interesting example of same-sex marriage. Read with me. This is in the second paragraph. Start where it writes, a barren Nuer East Africa female, barren, in other words, she can't have children for whatever reason, might pay the bride wealth to a family so that she may take a wife to bear children in her name. The female paying the bride wealth will then solicit, in other words, the female initiating this will solicit a male relative, maybe her brother, maybe an uncle, to impregnate her new wife, and the children will recognize the female who paid the bride wealth, in other words, the female that initiated all this, as their father, and in fact take her name at birth. In fact, it's quite possible that the sole motivating factor for this arrangement is the fact that a barren woman desires children. Sexual relations between the two women would be quite incidental if they occur at all. And it's not an important part of the relationship. I like to mention that one example because often when we talk of marriage and so forth in this country, we think of sex and romance. But please note that marriage often is an economic sort of arrangement that's made between different parties for various reasons, not generally having to do with romance and sometimes not even to do with sex. And there's a good example of a same-sex marriage that has been around, well, it's older than writing, best we can tell, for a long, long time, but really is not based on sexual activity at all. If you skip a few paragraphs down, you'll see where I discuss homosexuality in Nicaragua, and I do that just to show you the difference in sexual behavior and cultural ideas regarding sexuality that exist. Now, Nicaragua, remember, is a Western nation. It's part of Central America. It's Catholic. But there the dynamic is very different. For if you have two men engaging in sexual relations, the dominant partner, and I'm sure you know what that means, is considered to be macho, and the term machismo is used for that person. So this is a man's man because he's the dominant partner. Now the submissive partner, a derogatory term is used for them, cochons. And as you can read with me, cochons are therefore feminine men, or more accurately feminized men, not fully male men. So that whole dynamic is very different from our society. We really don't differentiate that much between dominant and submissive. But there, they do in a very stark way. Finally, the last topic addressed in this chapter is sexual orientation, nature or nurture or both. Well, please note that all of these arguments regarding whether or not a person is born that way or whether or not they choose that way are silly. That's a false dichotomy, as you might guess. It has nothing to do with science because actually, best we can tell, most behaviors are a little bit of both. And that's what it turns out to be here. I start off by noting that the traditionally sensualist views are influenced almost exclusively by religious concerns. In fact, they don't have anything to do with the collection of data, hypothesis testing, research designs, crunching numbers. All of that stuff is not relevant at all to the traditionally sensualist view of same-sex sexual attraction. And so that is one reason why you should find that information very dubious. And I do mention that here, but rather, and I'm reading, let's see, this is the, which paragraph is this? You can follow along with me here. So in the bottom of the first paragraph, or about the middle of the first paragraph, it's noted that these ideas are based on an assumption made about an ancient work of literature written approximately 3,100 to 1,900 years ago, with mythological roots that go back even further than that. And I'm talking largely about Genesis. Now, in the next paragraph, I give you 4 reasons. I could give you a 5th one, but I give you 4 reasons why the notion that someone chooses their sexual orientation is nonsensical. So 4 good reasons. The first, you can read with me, the standard rates of homosexuality, which by the way are 4 to 7% in every culture area around the world, are evident even in areas where same-sex behavior is punishable by death. So even when you go to those places where people could be put to death for same-sex sexual behavior, you still find it occurring at about the same rate. Right? So you see the point. I mean, what person would actually choose that fate for themselves if left to their own devices? Number 2, this rate is virtually constant across cultures and across time. So in other words, it appears as though it's something that's inherently human. It is part of the human condition. Number 3, gender atypicality in children, we talked about this earlier, confers upon them a higher propensity to be gay or lesbian adults. So there's a connection between gender atypicality, which itself is highly genetic, and same-sex sexual attraction. And number 4, an impressive body of research has uncovered a link between genetics and same-sex sexual attraction. So in other words, we've also found, in addition to the indirect link that goes from genetics to gender atypicality to homosexuality, we've also found direct links from genetics to homosexuality. That's discussed in the next paragraph. I do note some other studies that have established the genetic component to sexual orientation. The important paper is the Pillard and Bailey article found in the journal Human Biology. And you'll note the data I have there on dizygotic twins, which are twins from 2 different eggs, meaning they have the same genetic relationship as random brothers and sisters, compared to monozygotic twins who actually share the same eggs, giving them identical genomes, right? And you can see how the numbers jump up, how the numbers increase dramatically for monozygotic twins, which is what you would expect if there's a genetic component. Please read through that section very carefully. Of course, if you have any questions about it, just drop them in the Ask Questions Here link, and I'll try to address them. In the next paragraph, I note that in that paper, they estimate that the heritability of this trait is approximately 0.50. And it actually came out to be about the same for females in that paper as well. Meaning that about half the reasons why, let's say, your typical male would be homosexual is genetics, but the other half is environment, experiences, nurture, and so forth. And again, once again, I hit this gender atypicality issue at the end there. Finally, Pillard and Bailey note that gender atypicality can occur in children as young as 2. Clearly, 2-year-old toddlers are not consciously manipulating gender norms, right? No sane person would suggest they are. They're just behaving the way they are. Continue reading. Thus, gender atypicality is certainly influenced by genetic factors, at least to some degree. And the last sentence, at least in regard to gender atypical individuals, we see that genetics does influence sexual orientation.